What do you wish other CS educators understood better about social justice within, through, and around computer science education?
I think one core piece is that, when we wrote the most recent white paper, in our author's note, we made our own values really transparent. And like you said, social justice and using computing as a vehicle to support students in making change in the world and in being critical about technology, that's a core part of what we believe CS education is for. And lots of others believe similarly. And so in supporting folks who want to integrate social justice education with CS, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. I think that's the first point I would make. So many amazing social justice minded educators have already thought about great principles for this work. So culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy, which is Paris and Aleem, Gloria Lights and Billings, Geneva Gay. There's some real incredible thinkers who've been doing this for a while. Louis Moll and Funds of Knowledge. There's a lot that you can read and learn about. So there are all these efforts to integrate and to support social justice pedagogy within education at large. And the goal would be to think about, well, what does that look like in a CS context? A lot of those efforts fundamentally say the same thing. Get to know your communities, get to know your students' experiences and their ways of knowing and their aspirations. So a lot of it feels at this point even commonsensical, but bears repeating over and over because it often just doesn't happen. There are tons of ways to draw on the knowledge of organizations like in New York City, we have the New York Coalition of Radical Educators or the Connected Learning Community and the Hive Learning Network, where there are all these youth development organizations who've been doing this work for a long time. So I would say don't reinvent the wheel, look for these wonderful examples, and then forge strong partnerships with communities to really understand their values and their purposes for CS Ed would be a great start, because the worst thing that could happen is people coming in with their own notions of what social justice is and imposing that on others. Social justice is about building from the grassroots, listening to people, and then working in solidarity to fight for change and ensure a more just society.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I think one of the big messages I would have around values of equity and justice within CS education is that we've made really great strides in certain parts of the equity conversation. In particular, just the idea of CSforALL in and of itself is very powerful, right? It's the idea of a kind of universal access to something that we see as a good. And then, in particular, how thoughtful the conversation about broadening participation has been. About it's not just for all, but we need to say, part of that implicit in that, and we need to elevate within that this idea that there are particular groups that have been historically marginalized, historically excluded. African American students, young women, especially young women of color, students with disabilities, rural students. There's all sorts of groups that have really been excluded and not given access. We need to think carefully about those. We've made huge strides, and obviously we're not done with that work, but those are established as, I think, values. What is not yet established as values is, one, what Sarah just said, and I think what we're trying to partly argue for in this white paper, that equity is not just in outcomes, but in process. It's about who's at the table. And if you just impose from above, yes, all kids must, and then you don't involve anybody from a community, any students, any teachers, first of all, good luck with implementation. But second of all, that's really not equitable. That's really, it's kind of authoritarian. That's not how we want educational change to look. Even if it has some idea of equity as an outcome for students, the process really matters. So that's one way. And I think that we do see, and I think very smart, especially smart districts and smart out-of-school organizations that are really thoughtful and dedicated, really do, I think, approach in these ways, really do think, in New York, they really did an amazing community engagement process with teachers, principals, out-of-school organizations, industry, to think about what do we want this to be? And I was really excited to be able to participate in that, and kudos to the New York City DOE for the way they did that. I think the other big area of equity in CS that's underexplored right now is how issues of equity really play directly into the curriculum itself, right? You can think about equity in access to CS, but what is the CS you're giving access to? If it's just loops and variables, or even, amazing creative computing, there's lots of things that you're not addressing that are actually equity issues within CS that are critical. In the K-12 CS framework, there are 5 big concept areas. One of them is the social impacts of computing. And if I want to look for a curricula that teaches about loops and variables, then I've got a million options. And if I want curricula to teach about the social impacts of computing, my field narrows practically to 0. Right? There's very, very little out there. And those are the places where we can talk about things like algorithmic bias, things like, the culture of computing and how it might exclude certain groups and how we might think about changing and having those discussions with our students. It's a place that we can think about emerging issues of privacy and surveillance in society. It's the place where we can talk with students about what is the role of technology in democracy and public discourse, disinformation. And these are things that I think kids are really interested in too, right? I think that kids can really get into this. It also, from an implementation standpoint, means that you're not relying on teachers having to have all of this knowledge around very, say, quote unquote, deep. I would say this is a different form of deep, but what we might classically think of as like, well, I know 5 programming languages and now I can teach computer science. Every teacher in the world is like going to be like, holy cow, I'm running the other direction. But you talk to a social studies teacher about doing a unit on how to think about, the social impacts of computing in World War II. And wow, their eyes are going to light up, right? You have a whole different way in. And from an implementation standpoint, that means that you're also able to have that many more educators that are going to be part of this process. And so I think like that, those really 2 big points of equity in process and equity in the kind of as represented in the ideas that you teach about are 2 big things we need to elevate to go beyond, but not leave behind at all, the discourse around access and the discourse around broadening participation, both of which are absolutely critical, but we can't stop there, right? We need to extend those into further conceptions of what good, equitable, and justice-oriented CS education can look like.
This excerpt was from podcast number 21 of the CSK8 podcast, which was titled The CS Visions Framework, an Equity-Centered Computing Education with Rafi Santo and Sara Vogel. You can listen to the full episode as well as hundreds more by searching for the CSK8 podcast on your favorite podcast app.